Reading from 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 16. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the combination of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. Deacons, likewise, must be dignified, not double-tongued, not addicted to much wine, not greedy for dishonest gain. They must the mystery of faith, the clear conscience, and also be tested first. Then let them serve as deacons if they prove themselves blameless. Their wives, likewise, must be dignified, not slanderous, sober-minded, faithful in all things. Let deacons each be the husband of one wife, managing their children and their own households well. For those who serve well as a deacon gain a good standing for themselves and also great confidence in the faith that is the Christ Jesus. I hope to come to you soon, but I am writing these things to you so that if I delay, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is in the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. Great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. He was manifested in the flesh, vindicated in the spirit, seen by angels, proclaimed among nations, believed in the world, and taken up into glory.
So our topic today is Pastoral Oversight, and we're going to be looking at what Paul had to say to the church that Timothy was involved in at Ephesus, and looking at what we can learn that from ourselves. Now, in the past couple of weeks, we've looked at something of the context of this. We've looked at the Paul's situation, Timothy's situation. What I wanted to do today was just to look at Ephesus and just to understand the context of the church that Timothy was involved in. I don't know what you think Ephesus was, whether you think it was a village, a town, or a city. Certainly, you can go and visit Ephesus today. I think there's a slide which shows, John and I have been there, and this is a very typical route now where the tourists are zoomed up and down the street, and it looks quite an interesting place. But that doesn't really give you a feeling for what size it was in the time that Paul was writing to Timothy at Ephesus. The next slide shows the theatre that's there. And when you go there as a tourist, the theatre, it is impressive. It houses something like 25,000 people, which is, a pretty good size. I mean, what a typical football stadium that would seat, 50,000 or something like that, I'm guessing. But you can get a feel now for the size of the arena there, the stadium, the theatre. But so people are looking at that and they think, well, and it looks as though the population of Ephesus at that time was probably around 250,000 people. So it is a substantial place. It's quite big. And it had been round, it was probably founded around 7th century BC. So it was a well-established place. When this was written, Paul wrote his letter to Timothy probably around 62 AD. So how long had there been Christians in Ephesus when Paul was writing? Well, we know that when we read Acts 18 and 19, we get the stories there about when the church was first established in Ephesus. And that was probably written about 52 AD. So the church had been there for about 10 years. Just to give you some context to it. Now, Ephesus, at that time, it was on the coast. These days, the river that was there is all silted up, so you don't really get a feel for what it was like then. But it was a major trading centre, so it was a port, and also it was on major road routes as well. So there were a lot of people trading going on, and so a lot of quite wealthy people from the trades. And some of the commentators, I find it fascinating doing the research, and some of the commentators say it was probably second only to Rome in its significance at that time. The other thing that it was very famous for, the next slide, was the temple to Artemis. Now, again, this was a very significant building. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and it was 4 times larger than the Parthenon at Athens. What you see there is an artist's reconstruction of it. It was destroyed in 268 AD, but they can still tell from the platform how big it was. So you can picture, you've got Ephesus, which is like a major trading center, and it's the Temple of Artemis. Artemis was the Greek name. When the Romans came along, the temple to this Greek god Artemis, they thought, oh, that fits in quite well with our Roman god Diana. So it fulfilled this dual role. So you had Greeks and Romans who'd be coming there because the temple of Artemis Diana was there as well. So this is the context of the work you got. It was culturally sophisticated, evidently, and it was a place where men and women enjoyed equal opportunities. And the wealth that they had might give us another context. Laurie was very brave last week talking about the role of women. But some of the words, you can picture the affluent women would flaunt their wealth. And you can imagine them, with jewelry and again, in the church environment, Paul may well have been saying to Timothy, actually, it's better if you don't flaunt the wealth quite in that way. Maybe that's one of the things that was there. Life for Christians in Ephesus was probably quite hard. There would have been opposition. We know about that from what we read in Acts chapter 19, because a lot of the people there were making their money out of the temple worship, trading, and various places that we've been to, you can see around the religious area, the shops, people are making money out of not just the religious knickknacks, but, selling books and everything. So the trade that's associated with it is significant, and you've got the Christians are coming along saying, actually, there's a better way, and they were getting opposition from the local people. So for Christians, it was quite hard. And of course, we also know that Timothy wasn't a native of the city. Paul had asked him to go there. And the reason for Timothy being there was that there was evidence that Paul had heard that people were moving away from the truth. And he wanted Timothy to go there to restore things. And part of this restoration work was he wanted to see people appointed to positions in the church so that there could be both pastoral oversight and also so that the truth could be maintained. So that's the context of this book that we're looking at. And Timothy's stay wasn't expected to be permanent. So the passage for today has got instructions about how to choose people and also some important teachings about the church. I think what's important to realise is that at that time, it was a new thing that was happening. The concept of the church was new. Imagine them coming to that society. The Jewish people would have been familiar with a synagogue. Now, as I understand it, a synagogue was essentially the building where people would come and there would be teachers there. And there would be, the law would be read and the teachers would be there, and it would be very much a place where you came to be taught. And there would be administrative people around there. So the church itself was a new concept, quite different from the synagogue idea. They met in houses, not in a central building. And even the word church was new. Jesus used it. But in that culture, the word church didn't mean what we would think about these days. The Greek word that was there was one that was used in a non-religious sense for when a group of people would meet together for a specific purpose around a specific cause. That would be called the church. So it's true for us, but of course the church we know it is more than that as well. So they were taking a word that was used within that culture and applying it, but it didn't mean exactly the same as it did within that culture they were coming from. And Paul needed to teach people about what this new concept meant. So that's what you're getting out in these verses. What does it mean to be part of the Church of God? That's what he's saying. It was all new. Now, in these verses, Paul talks about two positions, two roles. And we do need to take some time to understand what Paul was meaning, what was he intending by these two words, and how do we make sense of them today? It isn't straightforward. I think Laurie thought he had some minefields to negotiate last week, and I think it's much the same today, and it's, let's see what we can learn. Like Laurie said last week, I'm going to give you questions to think about. I think it might be much the same as that this week. Episkopos and diakonos, these are the two words. Now, translators of the Bible have had great difficulty finding a word to use for the first of these, episkopos. And I looked, the advantage of the internet these days is you can look at lots of different translations of the Bible. And I looked at these different translations, and these are the words that are used in different translations to translate episkopos. Overseer, superintendent, bishop, elder, deacon, church official, church officer, church leader, pastor, leader, superintendent. Now, you can see the struggle that people have got, because you've got something, if someone says to you, bishop, you've got an idea that comes into your mind. And if you've got perhaps church officer, maybe something else comes in your mind. But you can see the problem that they've got trying to find a word to use to represent what Paul was writing about. The second word, diakonos, has less variety, and that's generally translated as deacon, but other people use servant, church officers, and church helpers. So I think the idea behind that is probably not as different with the first one. But how do we get a sense of what Paul might have had in mind, and how can we make some sense of it? What we do know is that in these verses, Paul is not really giving a job description. He's not giving a task list. He's setting out the qualities of the people for these roles. He doesn't even say what gifts a person has to have and what qualifications people might need. And we do know that human gifting is good, but we also know that God equips us to do his work. And that's the most important part of it. And the other interesting thing is, he doesn't even say you've got to be a good talker. Okay, so let's go back to this word, episkopos. Well, the second part of it, skopos bit, sounds a bit like, you're familiar with the word scope, like telescope and things like that. So the scope bit is to do with sight, and the literal translation, episkopos, is oversight. So the word overseer is perhaps the best literal translation of the word that is used. So where else are these words used, and how might that help us? So in Acts chapter 20, Paul is there writing to the elders from Ephesus, and he says there, so the Holy Spirit has made, he's writing to the elders of Ephesus, and he says, the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to care for the church of God. Now, the word care for is the word to pastor, to serve as shepherds. It would have been used for a shepherd taking care of his sheep. So you've got the word elders, episkopos, and pastor are together within those verses, which is quite interesting. Now, in his epistle, what Peter writes is, I exhort the elders among you as a fellow elder to shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight. So you've got the idea again of the elders to shepherd the flock of God, exercising oversight. So this overseeing is stressing this role of watching over the congregation. Now, diakonos, I think the New Testament gives very little directly about that role. But we know that in Acts chapter 6, when probably we think it can be read as the installation of the first deacons in the church, the word deacon isn't actually used in Acts chapter 6. But we can see in that situation that people were made servants, and the office probably be involved for various responsibilities of service around the church. So what does Paul say about the role of overseer? The first thing is that it's a good work that someone desires. He says it's a good work that someone desires. The contemporary English version puts it like this: anyone who desires to be a church official wants to do something worthwhile. And perhaps that gets to the nub of the issue. I think in this, we have choice, don't we, about how we spend our time. Where do we put our energies? How do we choose how to allocate our resources? Life at that time probably didn't have the complexities that we have in our modern life. So, but people still had choice about how they had to spend their time. And deciding how to choose what to do with your time is a big thing these days, isn't it? And Paul is saying that the desire to be involved in the church of God, to look after the saints, to see God's kingdom built, it's a good work. It's a good work. He's not saying it's the only good work, but at a time when there are so many demands on our time, so many choices to make. are we going to choose to spend it on the work of God's household? And it's through this that God is showing his truths to the world. Paul writes about, in one of his epistles, he writes about building a house with some different materials, some that will last and some that won't last. Peter writes that we're living stones that's being built together into a temple of God. And these give us some clues about the choices that we have. We can build with wood, straw. We can build with gold, silver, precious stones. They're the images he gives us in Corinthian epistle. But it's the first challenge we face is, are we going to choose to do a good work in our choice of our time? I've had people talk about the word calling. And I did some research, and I tried to find, in the Bible I looked at, the word calling and the words deacon, elder, whatever these words that we have that we're using today. And I was trying to find a link between calling and word deacons and elders. And this is the calling, is that as if you've got something inside you which says, this is what you should be doing, put it in a nutshell. How many references do you think I could find that linked calling to elder and deacon? Zero. The verses do look at a desire that you've got to do this work. That's one point. In Acts chapter 6, what happens there is that people were picked out. They were chosen to do the work. And that, I think, is perhaps what's key to this, is rather than sitting waiting for a calling, it's God is saying, what's the desire on your heart? What do you wish to do to serve him, to honour him? And that, I think, is quite fundamental. And of course, at that time, the work of the church, there was no full-time paid clergy. So the work of the ministry was done by believers within the church. There was work to do. And in addition to this work, they had to earn a living as well. There was a book I was reading, which Janet might well remember, called Rees Howell's Intercessor. And it was written about the time of the Second World War. He was involved in the Welsh Bible College at Swansea. And the author was a chap called Norman Grubb. He was a worker within the church in Wales. He's been called to serve the church, and in this book he goes through and he's talking about everything he's doing within the church, and you think, wow, this is fantastic. And then you realise he had a job as well. He was a coal miner. And I don't think he worked a short day. And I think when he got home from work, I think he had to spend time getting himself cleaned up. And you think, wow, he had chosen to do a good work to serve God, and he made a time to do it in his life. And God is looking for people, I believe, who desire to serve God. Qualifications, again, this is, you've seen that you've done a read through the list of qualifications yourself, and I don't really want to dwell on the qualifications too much, or perhaps it's worth looking at some of the more interesting ones. He doesn't give a job description or a task list, as I've said. He focuses on the person rather than the duties. What he gives is a set of moral criteria, personal qualities. He talks about people being blameless, someone against whom no evil can be proved, known for their pure life and their integrity. The one which is the interesting one is when he says, the husband of one wife. What did that mean in context? The commentators have lots of different bits to say about that. And the one that seemed to make most sense is something that looked at against the moral climate of the day. Within the Jewish community, polygamy was practiced. The Roman society in its earlier days had been quite austere, but as civilization was developing in the Roman society, that had become a much more depraved society. And there were people who wouldn't have bothered to get married. They'd had serial relationships. And of course, in the Bible, you've got the story of the Samaritan woman, haven't you, when Jesus says, go and fetch your husband. And she says, I've got it. And he says, no, you've had 7, haven't you, or whatever it is. So maybe the context of being the husband of one wife perhaps makes more sense in that context. And perhaps he isn't even saying that people should be married either. I think because if he had, then Paul wasn't married, and he would have been disqualifying himself from leadership positions too. So, but it is this high moral quality that he's looking for. And the reference to these relationships within the family suggests that the leaders should be able to care for their own family, and that's an indicator that they can care for the church too. The commentators, one dialect says, let's not take a legalistic approach to interpreting these verses. Paul is not saying that all church leaders must be heads of one household. A single person might be an effective leader in some cases. Similarly, personal failures 20 years back need not disqualify a person who's more recently been a good example. Paul expects Timothy to use common sense and good judgment in the way he applies this list. If no one meets all the qualifications, then Timothy should just pick the best person he can find. And certainly when people are founding new churches in some countries around the world, they have to be use the principles behind these rather than the details of it. Deacons. But the fact that the qualifications for deacons are very similar. That's what people first comment on. The qualities are needed not just for church leaders, but for all mature Christians. But again, these questions raise the role of women. I think Laurie did such an excellent job last week that I don't really want to raise that again. But what Paul does say is that people who've been proved or tried as deacons, as servants have shown by their steadiness, activity and zeal, have purchased themselves a good degree. So they're people who would be suitable for elders. That's what he seems to be suggesting. The word elders has appeared a number of times. And I think, can I leave it with you to consider what does the word elder mean within the context of our church today? Again, that would be something that would be different views in different churches. It's not something we've spoken about here recently, but it appears quite commonly through the epistles. So I'm drawing it to a conclusion. What does Paul say about the church? We read these words, you may know how one ought to behave in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, a pillar and buttress of the truth. And these are some important words to understand what is the nature of the church. And the reason he's writing about deacons and overseers is all to do with our lives together being the household of God, the church of the living God. He writes about it being the pillar, the church being the pillar and buttress of truth. So it's no human structure that we're talking about, is it? It's the household of God. We are the household of God. God is the architect. God is the builder. He lives here. He provides for the church. He is honored here. He rules here. And the imagery that Paul is using would have been that of the household at that time would have been different from what we have today. There have been multiple generations living in one house. So it would have been quite a large gathering of people in one house. And there would have been a clear leader, the head of the house. And so that would have been the image that he had then. So the church is the assembly where God lives and works, each member of which is a living stone, so that when we are properly united together, we grow up together into a holy temple in God. What does he mean by the church being the pillar and ground of truth? You read the commentators and you get a lot of different interpretations on this. The grammar could even be that it's God who is the pillar and ground of truth, but that doesn't seem to fit the context of the letter. He does seem to be talking about the church. So in what sense is the church the pillar and ground of truth? Before the New Testament came along, what we know is that God's truth was only partly revealed. It was like it was veiled in the Old Testament. It was full of shadows, types, and ceremonies and prophecies. It was like, looking through a fog to understand the truth of what God was about. But in the New Covenant, we know that God has brought things to light that were hidden before, and he reveals them through the gospel, through the miracles, through what we preach about in Jesus Christ, in his death and resurrection. And we know that these truths are to be shown to the world through the church. It is our mission. It is the mission of God in the world. And the church is that temple that's being built together by these living stones of ourselves who believe in Jesus Christ. And it's the presence of Jesus as the head and the heart of the church that makes these words true. The institutional church itself is not the truth, but it's Christ himself, whose church it is, that releases us. And it's our job to present God's truth to the world. So, just in closing, I was going to say, I think there's no greater privilege in life than to serve in the church of God. I don't think there's any greater privilege, is there? And do you have a desire to serve? There are needs in the church, just as there were in the early church in Jerusalem and in Ephesus. And God was looking for people who would step forward to offer themselves to serve. And it seems to me, God is looking for people who will desire to do this good work.